Hello, everyone. This is Josh with Big Slicks Anything and Everything. And for this video, we're going to be doing another horror video this time. And this time, I wanted to really kind of get in depth and look at the family dynamics we see in horror films and why they work so well and why they resonate with us. I was like thinking about this really earlier today about why sometimes horror movies hit us in a different way than maybe others. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with how we relate to the characters, especially if there's some sort of family dynamic or structure involved in that movie. And there are, of course, several movies I could have picked to kind of go through today on today's video. Only took a handful because I didn't want this to turn into some hour-long conversation. If I left certain movies off, it was just in the interest of trying to keep it short and concise as much as possible because, well, I do have a tendency to ramble a little bit. So the first movie I wanted to talk about, and it's one that many people are familiar with, is of course Hereditary. Now, here you have a situation where you have this family who's lost their daughter due to a tragic accident, and left behind is the mother, the father, and the teenage son who was somewhat responsible for the accident in the first place. So you have this son who is obviously not only grief stricken, but also stricken with guilt. And then you have the parents. The mother is basically going slowly crazy, going insane virtually. And then you have the father, who is just simply trying to keep everything together. And myself, I certainly find myself resonating in most with the father, played by Gabriel Byrne in this movie. Toni Collette gets a lot of praise and well-deserved praise for her performance in this, but I think sometimes equally, I think some people overlook Gabriel Byrne's performance in this movie as well. Um, it's certainly, like I said, it is a character myself as a husband and father can certainly relate to a lot, and that's really what about any movie's about, especially in the horror genre, is being able to have characters that you can relate to in some way, form, or fashion. Because with this character, all he's trying to do, he's trying his best just to keep his what's left of his family together, and with trying not to have it fall apart. Inevitably, he fails, of course, and it's not for a lack of trying, but it's just a thing of, as we all know, this movie does not end well for anybody involved in this. In fact, it actually kind of pissed me off what happened to his characters. One of the reasons why I don't love this movie, I like it. You know, a lot of people are really either love or hate Hereditary. I'm somewhere in the middle, but I do appreciate the character development in this with this movie, and I can certainly see where a lot of different people can resonate or with one character or another, either more or less. And for me, it was Gabriel Byrne's character in this. Now, the next movie, which is certainly ends a lot better than the previous one I talked about, is Stephen King's Silver Bullet, which came out in 1985. Now, this is like a typical good sibling movie slash werewolf movie in which the two characters, the brother and sister, Marty and Megan, they, like other siblings, they're constantly at each other's throats. Megan is often jealous of her brother, maybe because she feels he gets more attention because he is in a wheelchair, and there's a lot of resentment there. But as this story progresses, as this werewolf that haunts this town becomes more and more of a bigger threat, um, they kind of realize, with the help of their uncle, Uncle Red, who's played by Gary Busey, they really do come together when it matters the most and end up killing the werewolf at the end of the movie. And, they kind of realize as the story goes, and this is where it's a very positive thing for anybody watching this, um, despite the fact that they fight with one another, they find out, ultimately we're still family and we need to face this together, which they do. And it's a good life lesson, really. I would suggest if anyone's having a problem with a family member, and doesn't even have to be a sibling, perhaps, to sit down and watch this movie. Perhaps something like this will help iron out any differences you might have. Another movie, and this is one that a lot of people will fondly remember, is Friday the 13th, Chapter 4, the final chapter. And what's big about this is the dynamic you have between this single mother, her daughter, and her young son. And this is once again one of those movies where the brother and sister, or the two siblings in question, do kind of come together. Now, this family is not very dysfunctional at all. Now, the mother at one point is killed by Jason. We don't see that kill. It happens off screen. So therefore, the brother and sister are left fend for themselves. And of course, the son, as we know, Tommy Jarvis, who's become one of the main heroes of this franchise, of course, eventually goes ape shit at the end and just kicks the shit out of Jason. But it's always it's always kind of a fun dynamic that I think people have always liked, because they can, as kids, we could relate to this character a lot. And then if you're someone who's had an older sibling, you can relate to it as well. So that was with Friday the 13th. And I think it's one of the reasons why this particular chapter has always been considered one of the best amongst that franchise, or at least people's favorites. It's four is normally at the top of most people's lists when they list this, and I think it does have to do with this family structure that exists within this movie. It still has the normal tropes of most Friday the 13th movies, or any slasher film for that matter. But by adding this extra layer to it, I think it kind of sets itself above some of the other movies as well. Now, another one that a lot of people don't talk too much about when you think of family structures and horror family dynamics is the dynamic in Hellraiser. Now, at the core of this, you have character Larry, played by Andrew Robinson, who's recently been remarried. His first wife passed away, but from that marriage, he also has a young daughter by the name of Kirsty. By young, I mean she's a young adult, probably in her late teens, early 20s. So they do have this relationship where, obviously, like most good fathers, loves his daughter, just wants her to be happy, and the daughter kind of feels the same towards him. Unfortunately, he's married a woman that's not exactly the most endearing personality. At first, we look at her as being almost like an evil stepmother figure, and it almost kind of brings the whole, almost has a fairy tale side to it. When we think of Hellraiser, we obviously think of this Pinhead and the Cenobites and all the supernatural and psychological horror elements that those movies, particularly the early movies, brought to it. But there's also a little bit of a fairy tale dynamic, almost a Cinderella type of thing, with Kirsty as the young beautiful daughter, and you have this evil stepmother figure in Julia, who secretly, to add even more layers to the family dynamic, had an affair with Larry's brother, Frank. Now, of course, we know the whole story. Frank comes back from the dead. Julia brings back men so he can feed on them, so he can get his skin back, and it ultimately kills Larry. But it's always a interesting dynamic, because ultimately this whole story, at least the first two movies, are really about Kirsty trying to save her father one way or another, either trying to save him in the present life, or actually going to hell to try and save his soul. And so for father daughter relationships, that really works. And then anyone that's had, maybe, who has had a parent who's widowed or divorced, remarry and not liking their second spouse, can probably relate to it in that way, because it's even mentioned a little bit in Hellraiser 2. Now I think about it, where there's this scene between Julia and Kirsty where Julia tells Kirsty, They didn't tell you, they changed the rules of the fairy tale. I'm no longer the wicked stepmother, I'm the evil queen. So we see that dynamic even play out even more in the second film as well. And then we go to a lot of people's favorite, and that is It. And you can have your favorites between the miniseries and the movie. For sake of this, I'm kind of going with the movie, but they by and large have basically the same themes going on with it. One thing that Stephen King is really good at, I've always noticed in almost all of his stories, is how he writes for child characters. He seems to be really good at that, and also putting that family dynamic in almost a lot of his movies. We touched on Bullet earlier, which is another Stephen King story, and now we look at It. And there's really in this series, there's certainly several different dynamics going on between families, but the one I think we focus the most on is obviously the dynamic between these two young brothers, between Bill and Georgie. Now, of course, we all know the story. Georgie is killed at the beginning of the movie, at least in the theatrical version, by Pennywise the clown. And through most of that movie, at least in chapter one, Bill is basically searching for Georgie. It's a little bit different in the miniseries. He already knows he's dead, but in the theatrical cut, he refuses to believe that Georgie has is dead and is continuing his search for him. Now, of course, it comes to its climax at the end of chapter one when Bill finally comes to the realization that his brother is gone, and there's that group scene with him and the other members of the Losers Club that are all trying to console him. This progresses even further in chapter 2 as Bill begins to show not just grief but remorse for the loss of his brother as he begins to blame himself. As we see them as adults and they're remembering back, he begins to blame himself for not being there when Georgie was killed by Pennywise. But of course, it also has, and this is something that anyone who has lost a loved one, someone close to them, can easily resonate with and certainly affect them in that way. Uh, I would also say, of course, there's other family dynamics going on with this whole story. There's, of course, the dynamic that Beverly has with her abusive father. There, of course, later on, then there's it as an adult, Beverly's um, relationship with an abusive husband. You have, as they were kids, Eddie's relationship with his overbearing mother. But then there's the family dynamic that forms within the Losers Club themselves as they become their own family, both as children, but later on, then as adults. Now, the next one we will go to is Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. Now, we just talked about a brother brother relationship. Now, in this one, we have a sister sister relationship, albeit they're more or less stepsisters when we're talking about Rachel and their newly adopted sister Jamie, who had just, of course, as we know, the backstory is basically in this timeline, Laurie Strode's daughter. Laurie was killed along with her husband in a car accident, and then Jamie comes to live with Rachel's family, and she becomes a sister to her. And of course, Michael Myers gets on the loose and goes after him. And this is once again a family of two family members, maybe albeit not related by blood, but coming together anyways. And as expected, typically it's the older sibling who is trying to protect the younger sibling from whatever threat is out there. Now, this story, at least at the end of 4, kind of ends semi tragically as Jamie attacks her stepmother. It's kind of open ended whether she really killed her or not. In 5, it explains that the stepmother was actually only wounded, but some people believe they really did kill her. But that's a whole different story in itself. I guess that is a dynamic, but another family dynamic between Jamie and her uncle, which is Michael Myers. That evil has now circled around. It's first movie starts off with young Michael in a clown suit who just stabbed his sister, and here we come full circle at the end of Halloween 4, and Jamie has done the same thing in basically the similar clown suit with the scissors. So you have this two different family dynamics going on between Jamie and her uncle, who's the most vicious serial killer slasher or evil personified in Michael Myers, and this relationship she has with her older stepsister in Rachel. And then finally, and this is the one that always hits me the most, and this comes from another Halloween film, and this is Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. And I know this is a very divisive film through most fans, and I get it. I have my own critiques of this film. But the one thing this film does really well is exploring this dynamic between Sheriff Brackett, his daughter Annie, and then Laurie. Because as we know in the first film, at the end, Annie barely survives, where in the original film she actually dies, but in this one she barely survives, is discovered by her father, who's the sheriff of the town. Laurie's parents have been butchered by Michael Myers, and Sheriff Brackett has brought her into her house to kind of raise as her own. So we see this dynamic begin to form where all three of these people are traumatized in one way or another, and they're all trying to, in the case of Sheriff Brackett, he's trying to hold it together for both his daughter and Laurie. Annie's trying to hold it together as well for Laurie because their relationship has now progressed from just being friends to the point to where Annie almost becomes a big sister figure to Laurie. So therefore, despite her own trauma and her own injuries, she's trying to watch out for Laurie as well. And then at this point, Laurie's just spiraling out of control because of the trauma that she's dealt with from the year before. And it's definitely the best part of this movie. Like I said, I've got a few movie has its fair share of flaws, but one thing they did really well that I thought, as from a director standpoint, a writer standpoint, and something that all three of these actors did extremely well in portraying this dynamic, was just that. There's the scene, a sequence in which Annie is finally killed by Michael Myers. And earlier, prior to that, her and Laurie had just gotten in some sort of argument. So the first person to discover Annie's body is indeed Laurie, and we see the sorrow that, and maybe even the regret that Laurie's going through before being basically carried away by Michael. And then moments later, you have Sheriff Brackett walk into there to discover his dead daughter's body on the floor, and we see this progression with him. And quite frankly, I think Brad Dourif knocked it out of the ballpark on this. Playing this character goes from a state of shock to sorrow and then to full blown rage. And the reason why this scene has always resonated with me so much is because, at the time of seeing this film, I had an 11-month-old at home and another one on the way. My wife had just found out she was pregnant again. So we both saw this movie together, and I think both of us were really uh, taking a, you know, we this scene or this sequence really kind of affected both of us as being both parents for the most part and fairly new parents at that. So I kind of resonated with Sheriff Brackett in the way that I saw as another father would and would react to, and whereas my wife kind of resonated to him as a father figure and like that. And of course, my wife, I think, has always resonated with those three main girl characters. Starting with the first Halloween with the whole Annie, Linda, Laurie characters, because she herself is an only child, but had two friends when she was younger, particularly as a teenager, that were like these three sister type of figures. So that was, so it's, that's just another explanation how some of these movies can resonate with us. And oftentimes we hope that this particular family structure will survive or overcome whatever obstacle they're facing. but oftentimes they don't, which is basically the reality of life. Sometimes things don't work out for the best, but when they do, it's always good to cheer that on. And I think that's a lesson we can all learn from these movies is finding these characters, relating to them, particularly in our own family lives, and see how they actually reflect on us. I think in this day and age, I think it's always helpful to find positives within our own families, and even if that's we find that in a movie, even in particular a horror movie, I think that's always a good thing, and I think that's why these horror movies resonate so much for many of us that are big fans of the horror genre. So, um, I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. Leave a comment below and please like and share this video if you enjoy it. And we will be doing some more videos in the future. And until then, thank you for watching and we'll see you next time.